Hello, history class. It's Mrs. B. We're going to jump right into doing our notes for this section. So what you should have done already is print out the set of notes that I gave you that have to do with this video. It should say on your sheet a critical time at the top here, chapter 6, section 2. Now bear in mind, if you didn't have a printer, you can feel free to just write the notes that I sent you into your notebook or on a piece of notebook paper, however that works. I don't know what everybody has at home, but you could definitely just write all the notes out and then fill the blanks in as we go too, if you don't have access to a printer. So the last time that we encountered the Continental Army and the British Army, we were in Boston. It was the Battle of Bunker Hill. So Washington's army was basically surrounding the British soldiers who were in Boston. He was on Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill, okay? He ended up with all his cannons strategically posted, getting the British to leave and evacuate Boston, which was a big deal. They left through the harbor, they got on their ships, they were on their way to their next place that they were going to go to try to fight the American troops somewhere else. So now we're going to move on to the Battle of Long Island. So that's our heading. And the first bullet point says, after the British evacuated Boston, so Boston is our first blank, Washington anticipated their next target would be New York. That's the next blank after that. So he thinks that the British troops are going to sail basically from Boston down to New York. That is his assumption. We're going to find that he ends up being correct in this. So what he decides to do, April 1776, he takes his troops and he marches these less than 20,000 men from Boston to New York. So that's your next blank, is 20,000. And again, as I said, Washington is correct in his assumption because July 1776, British General William Howe, same general who was at Bunker Hill for the British, William Howe's our next blank, he arrives at New York. The spelling of Howe would be H-O-W-E for any of those who would need to know that. So he arrives in New York with 34,000 men. That's our next blank, 34,000. And not only does he have 34,000 men, but he has 400 ships, part of the British Navy, the strongest navy in the world at the time. 400 ships are out in the harbor, also with men on them. So 400 is our next blank for that. So he has plenty of men to fight. So when he gets there, at first, he offers a pardon to the rebels. So that's our next blank. Howe offers a pardon to the rebels. But Washington, believing that the rebels have done nothing wrong, replies, those who have committed no fault want no pardon. So fault is our next blank. Washington then goes about strategically posting his generals, next blank, and men in places that he believes will be beneficial to them for fighting the British. But they are indeed attacked by the British and Hessians. And we have talked about the Hessians before. That's our next blank, H-E-S-S-I-A-N-S. Hessians were paid soldiers or mercenaries that were actually from Germany. So German mercenaries that were being paid to fight alongside the British. Because of being overpowered, basically, the American troops are forced to retreat. So retreat is our next blank. And unfortunately, in this whole process where we have different, as I said, Washington placed different men and different generals in different places. Some of them, in the process of trying to get their troops evacuated, the troops may have evacuated successfully, but some generals were captured in this process. So captured is our next blank. And Washington, where he was set, actually had a good view of a lot of what was going on. And he just thought to himself how he was fighting among such brave men, seeing all that was going on and all that they were endeavoring to do. So the very next day, Howe was set to surround the American troops. So surround is our next blank that we need to fill in. So Washington knew he had to do something. So what he did was he needed to evacuate his troops from Long Island by boat. So boat is the next fill in the blank there. And he is going to move them by boat through the night, so they're under the cover of night, from Long Island where they are to Manhattan where they originally were. That's the plan. It was successful, thankfully. As the sun rose, a fog miraculously covers the last boats that are escaping. So fog is the fill in the blank there. It seems that divine intervention was definitely there. And so Washington is the last to leave the island. He wanted to make sure all his troops were safe first before he left, and an eyewitness did indeed see Washington leave the island last. So Washington is the next blank there. Now, during the Battle of Long Island, there was a Connecticut officer who, his name was Nathan Hale, Nathanhale, and he had volunteered to spy on the British. So he was an American spy that was being sent on a dangerous mission. The point of that mission was to learn what the British had planned for this Long Island battle. Unfortunately, he was captured while he was trying to figure out what the British were going to do, and then the very next day, the British hanged him. So hanged is the next fill in the blank. And we have talked about in class how all these men, whether you were a spy, whether you were in the Continental Congress and you were signing the Declaration of Independence, you were putting your life on the line. These were treasonous acts toward the crown. So these men could indeed be hanged, and Nathan Hale was for his service to the Continental Army. His last words were said to be, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." Country is the fill in the blank. And he became an American legend for what he did and the fact that he gave his life for his country. All right, so moving on, the next heading is retreating Continental Army. So Washington evacuated, and now he's on the move. He is actively being pursued by the British Army and General Howe. So he is trying to get his troops out of there. He moves a couple places and he ends up in New Jersey. Okay, so New Jersey is our fill in the blank there. And with all this happening and some different things happening in the colonies around them, the Patriot spirits were now pretty low. So low is our next fill in the blank. Something else that's happening is the city of Philadelphia is threatened. So Philadelphia, I'm going to spell that for you, Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, in July of 1776, this is where the Continental Congress was meeting, and Thomas Jefferson was actively writing the Declaration of Independence, and it was being approved on July 4th, 1776. So for that city to be threatened, it was making everybody nervous. Also, Washington had a lot to face because many of his soldiers were deserting. So he had to deal with that, the desertion of soldiers. That's our next blank, is deserting, as well as many of their services were ending. When you're a soldier, you sign up to serve for a certain period of time. Many of their services were ending, next blank, and they were considering not coming back. So a lot to deal with there. He didn't have that many soldiers to begin with in comparison to the British Army, and now he has to deal with this. So Thomas Paine, who actually was with Washington at the time, you should recognize his name because he wrote the pamphlet Common Sense that sort of sent the colonies into an excitement, if you will, for trying to gain their independence. He is with Washington and he decides to write a new pamphlet. It's called The Crisis. So The Crisis is our next blank. He decides to write this to encourage the soldiers in these hard times. So encourage is the next blank that you're going to fill in. Washington, excited about this too, decides to have it read to his troops. Troops is the next blank, just as a way to boost morale and keep their spirits up. So moving on, the next heading is the Battle of Trenton. So here we are, December 25th, 1776. It is Christmas Day, and we are in the evening, okay? Christmas Day in the evening in Trenton, New Jersey is not going to be much different than what it might be around here, the cold weather that we're experiencing right now in Pennsylvania. So keep in mind, Christmas Day in the evening, and it is cold. Washington leads his troops in boats across the Delaware River. Delaware River is our next blank. I'll spell Delaware also. Delaware is D-E-L-A-W-A-R-E. This is actually a very famous portrait that somebody painted where Washington is at the head of the boat and he's kind of looking out across the Delaware River as many of his men are rowing them across. And keep in mind, as I just said, it's very cold, freezing conditions. So as they're traveling, the water would be spraying at their faces. The story goes that it was actually freezing as it hit their faces and their beards and so forth. So very, very cold conditions these men are trying to deal with. After they get across the Delaware River and they get out of the boat, they now have to march several miles to the city of Trenton. Trenton is our next fill in the blank. Trenton. Our men in the Continental Army are down on supplies too. So some of these men actually don't even have shoes. They are wearing rags on their feet as they march through snow, trying to keep their feet from getting frozen and frostbitten. So again, very hard times for these men. We're now early December 26, 1776, the day after Christmas. Washington's army surprise attacks a group of Hessians that are there posted at Trenton. So Hessians is our next fill in the blank. They actually are able to surprise attack them from two sides. And this ends up resulting in an American victory for Washington and his men. Victory is our next fill in the blank there. Washington is also able to capture 1,000 Hessians after this particular battle's over. So 1,000 is our next fill in the blank. Keep in mind, the British are still coming towards Washington and his army. They are actively pursuing them. Pursuing is our next fill in the blank. Washington knows this, so he needs to do something. He has to have a plan. He ends up tricking the British by leaving his campfires lit at the camp they were staying at. So campfires is the next blank. And because of doing this, the British don't think anything is going on, and the men are actively escaping, again, in the cover of night, unnoticed. After they do this, they actually come in contact with a group of British soldiers near Princeton. And the American soldiers attack and actually damage the ranks of this particular British troop. And that's near Princeton. So that's our next fill in the blank is Princeton, Princeton. So that's it for today's notes. I'm going to be sending you another worksheet or note sheet and another video for tomorrow to complete. So you guys can be looking for that. And that will get us through this week's remote learning. So I will see you guys in the next video.